I'm just going to dive right in if uh, that sounds good. So, today we're talking about stress and trauma in the athlete's life. So, the way we'll go through this is sort of a day in the life of an off-season training day and a competition day through my own lens. But before we get started, a little background. I am Alice Merryweather. I am a retired alpine skier. I raced for the US national team for the last 9 years. I competed at the 2018 Olympics and the 2019 World Championships. And throughout my career, I struggled with an eating disorder. I was injured, had my fair share of stress and trauma, but also am so grateful for everything that sport gave me. So I'm excited to be here talking to everyone today.
And I'm Allie Don Sing. I got my master's in sport and performance psychology from the University of Denver, and now I'm a therapist at Walker Psychological Services in the Denver area. And then I've been lucky enough to partner with Koomba in the past year as a provider on their team in their journey of providing more resources to athletes related to athlete well-being and mental health.
Awesome. We're happy to have you today, Allie. So, diving right in, I'll kind of speak from my own experience as an athlete of what these various days looked like and what the different stressors were that affected my performance and could really pile up. And then we'll kind of go in at the end and talk about some maladaptive coping and some adaptive coping strategies. So, morning of a training day. Usually it's an early wake up. You've got a session in the morning. You might feel exhausted if it's one of several training days in a row. Uh, I know that, day 3 or 4 of a heavy training block never felt good to wake up in the morning. And also, as soon as you get up, you have to fuel. And for me, especially when I was struggling with my eating disorder, just getting to that first step to breakfast, like that was an extremely stressful experience because the idea of food, the emotions that came up with eating, all of that just started the day on a pretty terrible note. And I think a lot of athletes feel the same way, where they might have rules around food of what they're supposed to be eating, what they perceive as clean eating, healthy eating. And so oftentimes breakfast right away can be a really stressful experience. That then would lead right into a morning session usually. And so that involves a warm up, the main session, a cool down. All of that can, if it's a really hard workout, you might feel great after, but you also might feel exhausted after, and you might ha not have performed the way that you wanted to. And for me, I know that if I had a really difficult session and I didn't rise to the occasion, maybe I was still sore from previous days, I was tired, and I just didn't function quite as well. Like I would feel poorly about myself. That would affect my self-worth and the stress of not putting my best foot forward that day could bog me down for the rest of the day, if not longer. A lot of athletes also have school. Maybe they have to go to classes or they have schoolwork in addition to their morning session, or maybe they're working to pay for participating in their sport. And it leads to a really packed schedule, which again can be exhausting, can be really stressful. Um, and it's not over. That's only the first half of the day, right? Then you have lunch, which can bring up again all those food emotions, especially for athletes who might be struggling with food. I would always worry about if I was eating the right food, if I was eating the right amount of food, if I deserved to eat based on what I had done in my training session in the morning. And would honestly, if even if I had a good session in the morning, those emotions that came up with food at lunchtime usually brought me back down and contributed to a lot of stress for the rest of my day. Oftentimes, athletes in a heavy training block have an afternoon session. It's the same thing. You've got a warm up, main session, a cool down, takes up a huge chunk of time, which might take away from other things you'd rather be doing or need to be doing. You might have an injury that you need to go to physical therapy for, or just some maintenance work that can take up another hour plus of your day. Then you still have schoolwork to do. You might have to go to work in the afternoon. There's so many things, like athlete life gets very glorified, I think, in a lot of ways, and yet so much of it is just like traveling to and from all of these different things and feeling exhausted because there's never a moment to just sit down. And if you do, oftentimes I put rest and recover in there because that can be stressful in and of itself, where you feel like, oh, well, I'm not being productive right now. Like I don't deserve to rest. I don't have the time. I need to be doing other productive things. And so I think even making that time to rest and recover can be its own stress creator because it's such a mental battle of what you should be doing as an athlete.
And Alice, before we jump ahead, you've brought it up a few times now, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about with athletes of like that deserve mindset of I have to earn everything. If I haven't performed well enough or done enough, then I don't deserve rest. I don't deserve food.
Yeah, that's a huge stressor, and it's unfortunately talked about quite a bit in our society and between athletes, where the idea of deserving food or rest is a pretty widely accepted mindset. And I think it's so problematic because everyone deserves food, everyone needs food, and everyone deserves and needs rest.
Yeah, I really like how you invited in the need part because that's what I work on with my athletes so often of you need the rest, you need the food. And so I think that's a big way to start to change that stressful mindset with food and rest is by actually recognizing the need and how it serves you instead of trying to always keep score essentially of have I earned this today? Do I deserve it?
Absolutely. Into the evening at the end of a long day, you've had all these sessions, you've had school, you might have had work, you've had PT, you've probably had to drive around or move around between all of these things, and you still have to eat dinner. Again, those food emotions come up. I put up a picture of kind of an athlete's plate. Even if an athlete's, trying to get the right amount of food and maybe it's not there isn't an emotional link or an emotional reaction to food, it can still be very stressful when you're trying to fuel properly. And there can be a lot of rules of like, you need to be getting this percent carbs, this percent protein, this percent vegetables, right? Which can be very helpful, but also can add stress if, say, you don't have the resources to pay for, nice food that will get you all of these percentages, or maybe you're somewhere traveling for training that all you have available is a McDonald's and you're not going to be hitting those. Like it it's an admirable goal to have, like, and it's helpful knowledge to see what, it's is the right amount of things to be eating, but it's just not always possible to achieve that. And I think it can be really stressful for athletes if they know they're not reaching those goals, even if it's just not available to them on a given day.
And
Um, Social
Mind if
life.
I add
Oh
another
yeah,
piece to
please.
that? You were saying the resources, and I've been talking with a lot of different athletic departments, and even just the resources of learning this stuff, of working with a registered dietitian, because I think we see all these things on social media, TikTok, Instagram, whatever, and there's all these people claiming to have this knowledge or this insight or saying, well, this is what worked for me. I think that's also a stressor is we expect athletes to know these things, and yet half the time they're not actually meeting with the right people to give them this information. I'm curious if you could even share like throughout your journey as an athlete when you maybe did or didn't have those resources where you felt this pressure to know all this stuff, even though you're not a trained dietitian.
Yeah. I mean, I felt lucky that once I had made the national team, we had access to a dietitian who kind of walked us through what sort of the macronutrients we should be hitting with each meal and had that data. But then I would go on Instagram and I would be flooded with a lot of that, like what I eat in a day or what you should be eating, or like replace this food item for this. And that, even knowing the basics of like the ideal athlete meal, it's so easy for that to get overridden by something I see on social media, or like even an athlete that I admire. If they do a what I eat in a day, thinking like, oh, well, if she eats exactly this, then I should also eat that. And maybe I'll be as good as her, or my body will look like hers. And it kind of invites that comparison so easily when there's actual hard data, maybe in a different area, but social media just glamorizes all of that. And there's so much information out there that, like you said, is not most of it is not clinically backed.
And so I always say like social media isn't inherently bad, but we have to be informed consumers because you could get on there and say, oh, this is one of my favorite athletes. This is how she's eating or she's training, so I should do that. But we're so unique that it's almost often causing more stress by having all that comparison.
Absolutely. So other evening tasks, oftentimes if you've been really busy all day, you probably haven't had time to interact with your friends or your loved ones, your family. So evening kind of becomes that time for your social life, but you also might be exhausted. And so then you might be stressed because you don't have the capacity to interact with your friends or your family, or you might sacrifice some of the energy that you have left to hang out with them. And that can be exhausting in itself. It can be stressful if there are different dynamics with different people. And while social life and connection can be a really good tool for dealing with stress, I think it can also add if you're not quite in the right headspace to welcome that. And so that combined with the relaxing and unwind, sometimes those two can go together and sometimes they need to be separate and you have to prioritize one or the other, which then feels like you're neglecting one or the other if you're really in a deep headspace, and it can be really stressful. Oftentimes, early bedtime, you might miss out on some of the social life. Some of your friends who either aren't athletes at your level or have a different schedule or in a different training cycle, like they might be out doing something later in the evening. And because you have an early session the next day, you have to miss out on that. You have to go to bed, you have to rest, and all of that can contribute to a negative headspace, to feeling really stressed and overwhelmed. And when each little thing adds up, it can really bog you down.
And Alice, before we jump ahead, I know I hear often from my athletes kind of both sides of they feel really restricted socially to only their athlete friends or their teammates. And so then that feels like a stressor because they want to expand beyond that and they want to maybe talk about things beyond sport. Or I hear the other end where, I have friends who maybe don't compete at my level or really don't engage with sport and they just don't understand my lifestyle. They always think I'm making excuses or I don't want to hang out or I think I'm better than them. And it's like, no, I would love to go and hang out at 10 o'clock at night, but I have a competition tomorrow.
Right. Yeah, it becomes a very difficult balance to strike oftentimes. Moving into a competition day, this just kind of has its own different stressors, different contributors to how you might feel at the end of the day. Morning is the same. It's probably an early wake up, depending on your sport. For me, as a skier, it was generally before sunrise, wake up, eat breakfast again, which when I was struggling, especially with my eating disorder, that was immediately a very stressful experience of how could I fuel properly, but make sure I was eating healthy and clean and, so many rules that came in immediately, first thing of the day. Then do a warm up, make sure that my body is feeling good. Say something doesn't feel right in the warm up, like immediately that can be a stressor going into a competition day. Because, say, my knee is extra sore in the morning. I know that it's going to take more effort to get my body fully warmed up, to get my knee feeling good for the competition. And I suddenly am afraid that my knee's not going to feel good for my competition, that it's, what if I don't trust it during my race run? And like can immediate that warm up can have such a positive or negative effect on the rest of the day based on how it feels. At races, we would always have to drive to the venue. So that would just sometimes there are these really windy mountain roads. You might get car sick if you have to sit in the way back. Not always good for getting prepared to go ski at 80 miles an hour when you're just sitting in the back of a van. That always added kind of an element. Maybe you're running late, so you're really stressed about making it to the top of the course on time. That travel, I think, also can affect the entire day depending on how that car ride goes. For skiing, you do the final preparation. When you get to the venue, you get to do one inspection run down the course that you're going to be racing on. You memorize the course, you visualize, you maybe have a team meeting about what the team's plan is going into the race, where you need to make specific turns, things like that. And maybe your visualization doesn't go well. For me, like every once in a while I'd forget a couple of rolls, a couple of pieces of terrain, or where a couple gates were, and then I'd sit there panicking like, "Oh my God, what am I going to do in that section?" just more ways to get stressed out. Also, though, with the visualization, there were a lot of positives that can come from that. Doing it over and over again to feel more confident about the day was always a positive tool. So it definitely had its pros and cons. And then the competition itself. I think with that, the underlying nerves that go into the entire day of worrying about how I was going to perform, worrying if something could go wrong, trying to trying to filter through all of the negative emotions and all of the fears that I maybe had for any race day was really difficult. Like that's a ton of noise bouncing around in my brain. And while I figured out ways of dealing with that, like focusing on what I can control and feeling grateful for my ability to do the sport in the first place, using things like that to get through those nerves and cut through the fear that I maybe had, it's still like I had that underlying jitter all the time. And I think so many athletes feel that and it's not an easy thing to deal with.
Alice, I think obviously I have like a back seat or behind a closed door view of my athletes sharing this with me, but I'm sitting here wondering, you're surrounded by people, teammates, coaches, family, friends, whoever is there on a competition day. How much do you feel like they were aware of all these stressors and what you were internally feeling during all of this?
I mean, with the teammates and competitors that are around, we're generally all sitting in the same place before we go do our runs and everyone's feeling the same things at that point, which is very powerful for a sense of camaraderie. I think we all recognized the risks that we were taking in the sport that we were doing and respected that. At the same time, when for sea racing, it's an individual sport, but oftentimes countries function as teams. And so I had these teammates who, we were there, we were very supportive of each other. But at the end of the day, we also had to go out and compete against each other. So it's kind of an awkward race day dynamic where you're wanting to be supportive and you're also hoping that you beat all of your teammates at the end of the competition.
I always think of just how complex that is when it comes to connection of how much do I let other people in? How much do I share my stuff? I hear this narrative so often, which I totally do not believe, but like, will people perceive me as weak if I share my fear or my stress?
Right. It's really challenging and everyone out there, every competitor takes a slightly different approach to it too. And so I think being able to filter what everyone else is doing and just know what works best for you. Like if you're open to saying like, "Hey, I feel especially afraid today. Like, do you want to talk about it?" Like that's takes a lot of courage and a lot of strength and can be a really positive experience. But not every athlete, not every teammate or competitor is going to be the same way. Like some people might just go sit alone in a corner and that works for them. To you, that might seem standoffish and aggressive, but trying to find that balance of respecting everyone's individual needs and also finding space for your own. Always a very fine line to walk. After the competition, so for me, after a race, sometimes you'd stay for the award ceremony if someone ended up on the podium. Always a great thing. If you're not the person on the podium, that comes with a lot of mixed emotions, right? Like you want to celebrate that teammate, but because it's an individual sport, I might have been bummed because maybe I had a really bad race day and I don't want to be out there celebrating someone who did way better than me. But again, when you're a team, that's just how we always operated, and that's use that to try to lift everyone up. You've got to travel back from the venue. Maybe it's that same mountain road, go through all the switchbacks, feel a little car sick, got to fuel, hopefully throughout the day. Like ski races take a really long time. And so, like, I would be having snacks throughout the day, and all of those would probably be stressing me out based on if I was, the years that I was really struggling with my eating disorder, like that in itself, keeping fueled throughout the day. Every single time I got a hunger cue, immediate stress, right? So these meals, these snacks, staying properly fueled, having enough energy to perform my best, that alone was a really, really stressful experience. Oftentimes you still have to do a conditioning session. You need to get your body recovered from the competition, from the race, and get it ready to fire again because maybe you have a competition again the next day. Oftentimes our races were 2 or 3 days in a row, and it was all about kind of managing, making sure you could fire for a couple of days without running out of energy. Usually you go through video review, you talk to your coaches. Maybe they're really happy with how you skied, maybe they're not. That's really tough because there's a whole aspect of, maybe you didn't ski your best, but you're really proud of a couple parts of the course, right? Like sometimes that's what I would use is I know that I had some errors in certain spots, but I think like I was really brave in one section and I'm going to take that into tomorrow. The coaches might not see that. They might not recognize that. And so they might just attack, you made all these errors. Let's talk about that. And if you don't have a super communicative relationship with your coaches, then they don't know that you're trying to focus on the positives. It can be really stressful when they're kind of coming at you for things you might have already processed or things you didn't even realize. I think that review with the coaches was always really stressful because you wanted to make your coaches happy. You wanted to put your best foot forward. And sometimes it works out great and they're stoked with your skiing, and sometimes it was a really unpleasant 15, 20 minutes where you're going through the day and just focusing on the negatives. In the evening, you're prepping for your next competition, going through that video review. Maybe you're doing some of that on your own. Maybe you're visualizing for the next day if it's a similar course set, a similar hill. That can be stressful. It's just taking up time. It's taking you away from other things you might want to be doing. Maybe you have to go work on your equipment. Like with skiing, we have so much equipment, our skis, our boots, everything can be tweaked and dialed in depending on the snow, the course that you're skiing on, the set that it's going to be. And so working either if I was doing my own equipment, I would have to go tune and wax my skis every day, or working with a technician who's doing that to make sure that he and I have the same plan, we're on the same page, going and having those meetings. Again, it just takes up a lot of time. You have to be, very engaged. It's like studying your sport, right? You're just trying to be a student of it to make sure that you have the best plan with these technical aspects, which can be really exhausting and really stressful because what if you get it wrong? What if the setup you're choosing isn't actually right for the next day? So there's that added stress of what ifs that could always exist. You have the issue of resting and recharging again. On race day, that's almost especially hard. Maybe your family came to watch and you want to thank them for being there, or you want to have dinner with them, but you're just spread so thin that you can't. So either you're taking this time to hang out with them and maybe missing out on some of that visualization, video review, things like that, or you're choosing to prioritize those things and you're skipping out on spending time with your family, which for me would always bum me out. I would try to figure out what I needed the most, but no matter what, it kind of felt like a lose-lose a lot of times where I would want to be spending time with my family because I know they'd traveled to come to a race, and if on a night before a competition I just didn't have the time to, I would feel really guilty. And that's just never that's never a good thing to feel, even though they understand. Like my parents always were very understanding that no, you have a lot to do. You're racing again tomorrow. Like, absolutely go deal with whatever you need to. Even hearing that wouldn't really change sort of that stress voice in my mind of like, but I should be hanging out with them. I should be making time. It can just add so many layers to an already stressful day. Dinner, again, the same food patterns can be a really stressful experience, and oftentimes an early bedtime that can cut into things your family is doing. Maybe are at school and you had a home game, right? Your friends might still be going and doing something. If you have another game again tomorrow, you don't get to join them. That can be stressful. Do you have anything to add for a competition day?
I think just I love how you highlighted the glamour part at the beginning of, most people who are watching this from afar, maybe they're watching you on TV and it seems so glamorous, but I'm exhausted listening to you talk about all this. And very, very few people are seen behind the scenes. And so I think it's just so important to educate people and to validate the athletes of how much they're doing, because most of our society will look at them and say, oh, well, they're living this great life. It's so glamorous. I don't feel bad for them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the pictures that I included on this slide are getting back from a race, bags under my eyes, carrying all my stuff, and just feeling so drained. And then a picture of a tiny hotel room that I was staying in where like we lug around so much stuff. There's, a couple feet of floor space. It's certainly not the glamorous life that I think a lot of people think it is when they watch the Olympics or see your sport on TV.
Right.
Some other stressors, we touched on a lot of these, but things that can be more underlying throughout an entire season or every day, whether it's training, racing, off season. Team dynamics, we touched on that a little bit, where in individual sports, you might function as a team, but ultimately be competing. There might be team drama. If you play a full team sport, maybe there's competition for positions or, clicks within the team. That was always a terrible dynamic, but it's something that happens and can contribute to daily stress. Status within the team, especially, in my experience, whoever was skiing the fastest tended to get the most attention from the coaches and was kind of put up on a pedestal. And they had, the higher status until the next person came in and skied faster than them. And just those changing dynamics were exhausting. Um, Injury is a huge one. I missed 2 years of racing to deal with a leg injury. And, those, it was really, really hard to slow down, to miss out, to feel like I was falling behind when all my teammates were out still traveling the world, competing, going to Olympics, going to a world championships, and I was just on the PT table, doing leg raises or like the lamest little things, relearning how to walk, and it it really affected how I saw myself, forced me to do a ton of identity work, which ended up being really wonderful and helped me create a much healthier sense of self, but it took dealing with this injury and kind of going through a really dark patch to initiate a lot of that. And so I think injured athletes often get overlooked for the mental side of the injury. Just going and doing the PT, doing all the physical recovery, like that is only one part of it. And it's, in my opinion, the easier part of it. It's overcoming the mental side of that, the pain, the emotions, the identity stuff that was way harder than doing the physical work.
Yeah. Alice, the piece I'll add to that is so many of my injured athletes, like you're highlighting, that identity piece is just shattered and really confused because for so long it's, I'm Alice the skier, or I'm blah, 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 this type of athlete. And unfortunately, I don't feel like many resources around them are well informed of how to support an injured athlete. I think injury is really uncomfortable for everyone, whether that's your trainers, coaches. No one likes to see you in pain. No one likes to see you removed from something and things outside of your control. And I noticed a lot of toxic positivity coming back in there of like, well, don't worry, everything's okay, or everything happens for a reason. And, some of those statements can be helpful in the right context, but sometimes I think they're really invalidating and they're almost super isolating because then you feel like, okay, well, everyone else thinks I'm fine, but I don't feel fine.
Yeah, absolutely. The toxic positivity is something I struggled with quite a bit. Like I would rather just have someone say, "I'm sorry, that sucks," than
Mhm.
like, "You're gonna be okay. You're so strong. You can do it. You can come back." Like oftentimes I was not in a headspace to receive that.
Mhm. And truly, the reality is, as uncomfortable it is to hear, you may not be okay. There are
Yeah.
some athletes where this is where their career ends, this is where their livelihood ends. And I know that feels negative and dark, and yet that is the reality. And so when people say, don't worry, you're going to be fine, I think a lot of my athletes think, but what if I'm not, or I've had an experience, or I have a teammate who wasn't okay. So that doesn't feel realistic to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Some other stressors. We talked a bit about social life, how to balance friends who maybe don't do your sport, who maybe don't do sports at all, and how there's kind of a different culture there. It is so wonderful to have friends who are outside of your sport where you can move away from your team when you need space from them, and it can be so healthy, but it also can be emotionally tough when they don't understand why you're devoting so much of your time and energy to training and racing and traveling, things like that. Also, when you're so busy being an athlete, like finding time for your family, finding time for your loved ones, maybe significant other. sometimes they don't understand what you're going through and they just feel like, they're second to your sport or they're too far down the totem pole. And it can be really hard to make sure that you're taking care of those people while also taking care of yourself and putting effort into your sport, your social life. All of that is a really difficult balance and it can be really exhausting. I didn't put social media on here. I think that could kind of fall under social life where it becomes very easy to compare your life to others, whether it's your competitors who are maybe doing a different training regimen and you think, well, maybe I should be doing that training. I should be doing exactly what they're doing, eating what they're eating, or things like that. Or maybe it's friends who are outside of the sport who are going on a beach vacation while you're in the gym training. And that can be really, really disheartening and stressful and make you maybe question everything. Like, why am I doing this? I could be on a beach right now, or I could be having fun with my friends, and I'm here working a job and then going to the gym and then going back to my job and then going back to the gym. I think social media, in addition to all the kind of clinical or non-clinical health advice that's out there, also just the comparison that it creates is so harmful and can be really lovely. Great to stay in contact with a lot of my competitors. I used Instagram quite a bit to be in touch with some of the European racers and have fostered a lot of friendships that way. But equal parts, it's been really stressful and providing too much information, too much comparison.
And Alice, I'm not sure if this is a part of your story, but I think just as social media is becoming bigger in athletics and younger athletes on social media, just what people refer to as those like keyboard warriors of people saying really nasty, toxic, just judgmental stuff on athletes' post and completely forgetting that they're a human who may see that. And I don't know if you have any personal lived experience with that or teammates or friends where you've just seen that completely destroy them or really harm them because it is so cruel sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just hate messages in general online. I've seen my teammates get some of those if they've performed poorly. And I mean, with sports gambling too, actually, I've
Mhm.
seen a lot of online hate rise because of that, where someone bets on one of my teammates and then they don't perform and like have gotten these really horrific messages of like you need to retire, that was pathetic. It's just social media opens a whole new door of access to athletes and that can be a really, really ugly world. I kind of want to jump to body image with that because there's so much language and it's so common to comment on an athlete's body, especially in the more aesthetic sports, which ski racing is not one of them, but we are out in spandex every day. And I really struggled with that, especially when I was going through a lot of body image issues and my eating disorder. Every time I would have to be just in my speed suit, I felt so exposed and I felt so uncomfortable, wanted to crawl out of my skin because I didn't feel like my body looked like an athlete's body. I had gotten this idea in my mind of what an athlete should look like. And I think this is so common of like the ideal athlete, what what you should look like if you're going to be performing at the highest level of any sport, right? Like chiseled abs, like muscles popping out. And it's just like most people can't look like that. Like they're just genetically not able to. And they can perform incredibly well. They can win the Olympics and not look like that. And that gets so lost. And I think social media contributes to that so much because, I mean, there's photo editing, people elevating certain body types, algorithms elevating certain body types, and then those hateful comments when an athlete doesn't match what one troll on the internet thinks they should look like, and they can just comment, they can just write that down for the public to see.
Yeah, I think the body image is so painful for many athletes because there's this ideal of what a certain type of athlete should look like. But Alice, I'm so glad you said that most of the time, many of us cannot look that way, first off. And then second off, That is not the only indication of how good you are at your sport. I've actually seen it where there are athletes who have become too focused on their body shape and size and actually lose performance and really actually set themselves up for really horrible injuries because they become so focused on the body shape and size.
Yeah, I mean, for my own struggles when I was dealing with anorexia, I was very focused on what my body looked like and it severely hindered my performance. I attempted to get ready for race season and kind of in the final preparations for that race season starting that year when I'd really been struggling, like I I was so slow at skiing. I could not compete with these women that I usually was equal with or beating, and it was crazy the effect, the physical effects of my own performance because while maybe my body looked a way that I was happier about or had been like striving for, this eating disorder had told me was a good thing. It completely hindered my ability to do my sport, what I had cared about and had been my priority for my entire life. And so it interrupted that, and I ended up not being able to race that season to go attend treatment for the eating disorder. And thankfully, I got the care that I needed and was able to return to my sport after that. But it did significantly affect my performance, even though I was, striving for what I thought was the athletic ideal.
Mm. Yeah, so then all to say, all of these stressors can then manifest into larger, deeply ingrained trauma. And that
Exactly.
brings us to our next slide of coping. Of we see in athletes whenever they're facing stress or trauma, just like any other human, they try to cope with that stress or trauma. Unfortunately, what we typically see is that left side being focused on. So, how Alice was speaking to eating disorders, disordered eating, addiction, body image distress, unhealthy relationships, self harming behaviors, isolation, all of those we start to see pop up. Um, and I feel for my clients when they're engaging in these behaviors or actions because what it's telling me is they're in pain, they're trying to gain back some sort of control. And so I'm never mad at them, I'm never ashamed of them. If anything, I feel for them. Like that is so human to want that control to bring safety, love, acceptance. And so what I always try to highlight to them is what you're striving for, whether it's like that safety, control, or acceptance. Those are not inherently bad. That's very human of you. That's actually really healthy of you. They are wanting these things. We're just not going about it in a healthy, productive way. And so really trying to invite in that right side, and not to say the right side is a fully extensive list, but these are some of the top ones we go to when trying to switch from those maladaptive coping skills to those adaptive coping skills. Because like I said, we do need the love, we need the connection, we need the safety. We just don't always see how that left side is actually creating more issues and more isolation, more unsafe behaviors. I always call it this control loop of when we try to over control something, we actually typically create what we were trying to avoid just in a different way. And Alice, I'm curious of when you were speaking about your eating disorder, if you ever noticed that control loop of I was trying to become something or control something, but I actually caused something else through that.
I mean, absolutely. Kind of with that performance piece, right? I was trying to control the way that I was eating and working out and how I looked because I thought it would lead to the outcome of being a better athlete, of being a faster skier. And instead, I was a much worse skier. I was slower. And so then I was like, well, I need to do better. I need to eat cleaner. I need, it was a constant feedback loop of spiraling in the wrong direction.
Grasping for more, I don't know if you've heard this in your own work, but one of my favorite sayings is more is not always more. And that really rattles an athlete's brain because I think the way they're wired is, well, if I just do more, if I just work harder, then it'll get better. But there's a certain tipping point where that's actually more harmful than helpful.
Absolutely.
How would you explain that to athletes of the more isn't more mindset?
Oh man, I think the best way to understand that is to think about what your body needs. Like put
Mm,
aside what maybe your mental goals are, what you want from your sport and your career, and instead just think physically, how do I feel right now? Like, what session did I do yesterday? What did I do today? Do I feel exhausted? Do I feel like I still have energy? Do I feel like I'm getting stronger or do I feel like I'm plateauing, right? And that's kind of what, for me at least, it, tuning into what I needed allowed me to then have that more is not more mindset because then I could realize, like, oh, I'm tired. That doesn't mean I need to train more so that I won't feel tired in the future. That actually means that I need rest. And
Mm,
then tomorrow or the next day, I'll have way more energy and can actually do a session the way that I want to instead of running myself into the ground.
exactly. And I know today we were more focused on just the impacts of stress on the athlete, but I always like to provide resources still. And so these are some of my favorite resources to go to give to my athletes just for mental well-being and managing stress. But we know a lot of presentations today are more focused on those interventions or tools.
Yeah, I think that's a really great list, and there's plenty more out there as well. Um, so thank you everyone for watching. Thank you especially Athletes for Hope, Koomba, Allie, you're at Walker, I believe.
Yeah, just private practice.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Otherwise, we can wrap up here.